Okay. So I would like to introduce you my colleague here at Boğaziçi University, AyferBartuCandan. So when we were organizing the summer school, fellows asked for an anthropologist specifically. And so here we have our anthropologist, and she is here at Boğaziçi University at the Department of Sociology. And her research interests mainly include urban anthropology, political anthropology, space, power, and gender. And she has very good work on Istanbul as well, and I'm sure she will be telling us a bit this during the session as well. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
First, I'll start by sitting, and then I'll stand up. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and insisting to have an anthropologist. But when I first heard that from Begüm, I was a bit worried because I wasn't sure what you were expecting, insisting on anthropology. And and how this becomes a commodity in the global market. So you can actually click on these stories and it won't happen. And many environmental activists have been talking about the environmental impact of this, obviously, I mean, completely changing the whole geography of the city. And we all know that this is actually for urban development. And the Prime Minister at the time also said very explicitly that he wants to create a second Istanbul, you know, as if we didn't have enough, you know, first Istanbul. So I mean, we can go back to some of these mega projects if you want at the end. I just want to be very brief because I want to talk about some other things. But this is just to give you a sense of the kind of also environmental struggles that people have been running from one demonstration to another and trying to make sense of this all. The third airport, so that's supposed to be the location of that, which is also related with the third bridge that is it still being built? It is, yeah. Yeah, anyway. So the third airport, and that area, the third airport and the third bridge, you might sort of vaguely see there, it's really the last green areas in the city. It will completely sort of destroy the whole sort of ecology there. Estimated cost $29 billion. It's huge, mega. And the third bridge, obviously this that's supposed to be the third bridge. I mean, we can raise a series of questions that are extremely relevant also for political ecology. Who needs that bridge? Who needs that kind of private transportation? Is it really meaningful to invest in that kind of transportation rather than others? Or whose need is that, and so on? And also in terms of the impact of mega projects, there's a whole sort of literature on that, which are very relevant for Istanbul case as well. But so these are one set of projects that are ongoing in Istanbul. The other set has to do with, again, I'm not sure how many of these will be really implemented, building sort of 7 skyscrapers representing 7 hills of Istanbul, sort of creating a small Dubai there. Privatization of a very controversial Galata Port project, privatization of this area and catering to cruise tourism. And this is also very much related, I think, with privatization of many public spaces in the city. So this is one line of contestation in the city, as many other cities. Well, famous Taksim Square military barracks, rebuilding that's the Gezi Park. Well, park is still there. So, but this was the project, the pedestrianization of Taksim Square and rebuilding the military barracks as shopping mall. Well, at some point it was termed urban museum, city museum. Well, it's still a park. These mega projects, you should also get the sense that the way we learn here about these mega projects is actually you wake up one morning and you are told that there's going to be this kind of a project. So this decision-making process is actually part of the environmental struggles in Istanbul context as well. Another type of series of projects that I will spend a bit more time on is what has been referred to as urban transformation projects, UTPs. You might sort of hear this over and over again. And they also take on different forms. These are, the scale is very, very different. One kind of scale, one type of urban transformation projects is to invite star architects to Istanbul and give them literally helicopter tour of some of these neighborhoods. And this is a neighborhood on the, well, it doesn't look this way now. It's a very industrial, working class neighborhood on the Asian side. And when I'm talking about neighborhood, this is supposed to be Kartal. I'm talking about approximately 100,000 people. So that's the scale of the neighborhood that I'm talking about. So Zaha Hadid, the Iraqi-British star architect, she was invited to Istanbul, given a helicopter tour of the neighborhood, and she was asked to design a new neighborhood there. Well, with one exception that, you know, she didn't need to take into account 100,000 people who are already living there, right? So this is a working class neighborhood. So this is the kind of design, the futuristic design that she came up with. Obviously very much a gentrification project, and there is no account of what's going to happen to these 100,000 people. I mean, it's one thing when an architect has a vision, but it's another thing when the mayor of Istanbul declares that this is going to be the future of this neighborhood. So this is still a pending So you have to make an agreement with Mass Housing Administration. So your house is demolished and you sign an agreement with Mass Housing Administration, and you are relocated to these so-called public housing projects, and you pay the installments, the rest of the money for the house in 20 or 25 years subsidized installments. Okay. But here the assumption is that everyone is able to pay that installment, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So what happens with this land is, so they're open to more middle class or upper middle class residential housing. So it's not that they're not unrelated. This is just one. With its own facilities in it. They also have educational facilities. So you don't really need to leave this space. So you get rid of the traffic problem, you get rid of the air pollution. So this is his dream project, right? I mean, obviously it sounds crazy, extreme, and so on, but I think what is happening in Istanbul, as in many other cities, is actually, this is really where we are going. So this might sound crazy, but some of the compounds that I'm showing you are actually operating in this way. I mean, not that they are resolving urban problems, but they also, many of them believe that they do have sort of very environmentally friendly compounds and solving urban problems and not dealing with it, and with no consciousness of their impact on the rest of the city and so on. That becomes invisible. So what is it really that we need to really, without romanticizing the squatter settlements, how they survive and so on, we really need to capture the everyday practices and how people have been interacting with the environment, and in what ways that was actually sustainable compared to these. These are really questions that we need to address. And I think many of these issues became very explicit during Gezi Park, and probably there has been only one thing that I agreed with the ex-prime minister when he said, well, the Gezi Park is not about a couple of trees. And I agree with him, and that's very rare that I agree with him. It wasn't only about trees. It wasn't only an environmental movement in that sense, but it was actually about urban existence. What kind of urbanity that we want, and who decides about that? What are the decision-making processes? So I think that's what the Gezi struggle was about. And as many of you know, it was violent, and but it was one of the most. Now we're being nostalgic about it, but it was a very interesting movement, I think. I mean, we still need some. We need different terms and time reflection. We need to make some reflection on what the movement was about, the kind of solidarity, who was coming together, and why, and how, and so on. And let me end with, as I said, it was violent. Let me end with an image that some of you will be familiar with. This is a group of young people who were killed during the demonstrations. This is an artistic depiction of them together. I mean, they were not together when they were killed, but this is a new sort of imagination for the city. Let me stop here.
Hello, I'm Felipe. I'm part of Entitle. I'm from Brazil and working in Coimbra, Portugal, and work also with indigenous groups in Brazil. So I was interested to hear a bit more of the ideas of indigeneity as you proposed in the beginning. As I could understand, I don't know if that's the way, but
and so forth. I'm from Ankara, as many of you know, and so very recently we had this very terrible TV advertisement on a project called Marina Ankara with Hülya Avşar and her daughter, who's a big pop singer, and actually they are telling that, oh, mom, shall I just sign up for an Ankara university? And then she says, well, there is no sea in Ankara, because unfortunately Ankara is a landlocked city. And eventually this project promises to bring a sea to Ankara, which they are actually extracting from a big river nearby that will actually cut the veins that go to the last public lake in Ankara, which is Ottu Lake anyway. So I think it's just a common pattern that's kind of developing, and this has a lot to do with the whole accumulation system and accumulation strategy. But what I really wanted to mention was about this, the projects that you've mentioned from Zaha Hadid, and the whole notion of this helicopter ride and taking a superior view. Because I think this resonates well with something else that you've mentioned about cleaning up around the Olympic Stadium. So there is this godlike features of urban transformation. So someone basically have a vision, goes through the city with a helicopter, sees something, says, well, we changed this, we cleaned this up. And I think this goes hand in hand with what has happened during Habitat summits previously in Turkey, then with NATO summits in 2000s, and probably with G20 this year, that we will see there is this cleanup of the city, be it from migrants, be it from the stray animals, be it from the poor communities. And this is the Olympic Stadium, I think, is a good example on that. So I'm reminded of when you showed this, like this godlike feature of the speech by China Miéville called Limits of Utopia. And actually there, he mentions that we shouldn't necessarily think that
can easily be taken back from them. So they couldn't count on that as a legal document. So organizing or mobilizing a resistance movement in a neighborhood where you have this really mixed property regime, I mean, some people have more to lose than the others. I mean, they have to agree with the mass housing administration, otherwise they would be left with nothing, right? So one option is to agree to go along with the mass housing administration, and if they could pay, they could own the house, and maybe they'll survive. But they don't have the other option, and they don't have anything to count on. Well, the owners, or the ones who have a bit more proper title deed, they did resist. But they resist not because they were against the urban transformation project, but they wanted to have a better deal with the mass housing administration. So it's a very complicated picture. And the property regime has a lot to do with that, and the history of squatter settlement, what it means, and so on. So also we can't really romanticize, or we can't expect, or we can't be angry to people who didn't resist. They had all the good reasons not to. In that from another squatter settlement, which is not a Kurdish settlement, but they are coming from the Black Sea coast. So in terms of squatter settlements, this group is also coming from a squatter settlement, but they're a bit of a more lower middle class. They have a bit of a more stable jobs, but they didn't want to see the Kurds around them. They were so happy when the Kurds left. And they saw themselves as actually winning in this process. So they managed to own an apartment building in this new settlement and managed to kick the Kurds out. So they were quite happy and they were voting for AKP because they saw themselves as winning in this process. So we shouldn't really have this picture of sort of squatter settlements versus the ruling party in a way. Because there are also differences within, as I said, there is a sort of social stratification within squatter settlements, and also there are ethnic differences. And they are very important in terms of who can live together with whom and under what conditions.
Okay. Okay. My question is not in the central part of your presentation, perhaps not your expertise, but at the beginning you said about this trauma with ecological anthropology. So I wanted to hear why was it so traumatic, because I've read some of them and I like them, so I want to understand why anthropologists were traumatized by them. I like the work of Marvin Harris, the witches and the pigs and all these things, and then he has, for example, some arguments. He says, okay, the Aztecs were eating humans in huge sacrifices because they lacked protein and because the ecosystems could not support animals. So I can understand that this is a little bit deterministic, but I don't understand why is it traumatic. And I'm trying to understand whether there are anthropologists today that are trying to get something useful out of this type of ecological anthropology, because I think there are nice things that they're trying to understand how the ecosystems and our adaptation to them affect certain social practices. I think one more, yeah.
Thank you. Ashish Kothari from India. I just came in, so hello to everybody. But the process you described about gated colonies and what's happening, it's actually so similar to what's happening in India, which you may be familiar with. And also, again, this, the imagery of green housing and wake up to the call of birds and stuff like that. I mean, it's all very similar. I don't think I haven't seen an advertisement as blatant as the one that you showed at the end, but they're fairly similar. What I was wondering was whether you have developed, or it's possible to actually maybe have some collaboration on developing the sort of, in terms of the principles and values of what would be an organic city process or urbanization process. I like the word organic, I think I'm fine with that, versus what's being imposed. So for instance, resilience versus fragility, at least in terms of the poor people and the environment. Direct radical democracy versus imposed technocratic, if one can even call it democracy or whatever, rule. And so on, so that we're actually able to develop a narrative which may be able to appeal to a much larger number of people, not just the victims, but also others. So I don't know if you actually develop something like that. Any thoughts on that would be very useful. Thanks.
Well, I haven't really developed a full-scale sort of that kind of a framework, but that is, in a way, what I'm also simultaneously trying to work on. I mean, I've been collaborating with Teresa Caldeira, who works on Sao Paulo on gated communities, and but I mean, I concentrated for a long time on, although there is this international literature on gated communities, it's very recent that we actually started discussing that in the Turkish case. So that has been part of my effort and energy, trying to problematize gated communities and trying to talk about why it's a problem. But what you're suggesting is very important. That's why I think of the Kurdistan case as very important in terms of sort of grassroots mobilization, alternative ways of creating cities, and so on. But that discussion also needs to take into account workings of capitalism. Some of the exercises that I've heard and suggestions that I've heard are, I think, I mean, I shouldn't call them naive, but it doesn't really engage with the workings of capitalism. So it's tough, it's difficult, but it's worth trying, and also looking at different examples in different parts of the world, and theorizing and coming up with alternatives. I mean, right now I don't have that kind of a framework, but that's really, I think, the way to go, really. In terms of Marvin Harris, we're not really traumatized by Marvin Harris, but the trauma has more to do with, I would say, history of anthropology, in a way, especially history of physical anthropology. And its complicity in colonialism, racism, and all that. And also, I mean, the kind of work ecological anthropologists have been accused of, reductionism, not asking any additional questions regarding power, history, colonialism, and so on. So I think that's part of the problem. But I think what happened in many anthropology departments, I mean, I'm more familiar with the North American context, is that they had what I call nasty divorce. They stopped talking to one another at some point. I mean, when I was a graduate student in the 1990s, there wasn't any ongoing conversation. I mean, I went to Berkeley, and we heard that when I was there, Stanford, they split the departments. They just split the department into two, more sort of physical anthropologists and social anthropologists, and they stopped talking to one another. It's only recently that they reunited. I mean, that also obviously has a lot to do with the use of resources and so on. The dean, I think, pushed them to do that. But it was really a very nasty divorce that they had. But I think now that's why, I thought Anthropocene debate is interesting, because it is calling for a new kind of dialogue between social anthropology and physical and natural sciences, let me put it that way. And I think, Anna Singh, I think Povinelli, and many people are actually going in that direction. And what they are going back to is not necessarily Marvin Harris kind of questions, but probably posing new kinds of questions, but trying to have a conversation with the two. And I think the problem is that that kind of end of dialogue between ecological anthropologists and others, social anthropologists, also had a lot of damage, I think. Because now I think that the pendulum really went the other way. Now I ask some of my graduate students, for example, they've been doing some work on urban transformation. They talk about subjectivity, governmentality, all this sort of high theory. And I ask them, well, how many people live in this neighborhood? They can't answer that question. They are so much in this sort of high theory, this and that, and Deleuze and Foucault and so on. But, these are really basic questions. I'm trying to convince some students to actually count, measure the amount of water that is consumed in one neighborhood, right? They shy away from that. I think that, it has to do with that still. I think the consequence, children are suffering from the nasty divorce, let me put it that way. I think it's time to go back, and I'm very excited about collaborative work. We can ask new and common sort of questions that will be exciting for everyone who are part of the project, taking into account of history, capitalism, colonialism, but counting, measuring, and doing also that kind of research as well. But still, that's a challenge, let me tell you. They can go on and on about subjectivity, but would have difficulty telling you how many people live in that neighborhood, or what they eat, for example.
Thank you, Ayfer, for this really inspiring talk.